The photograph that should not exist. March 11, 1945, Kanoya Air Base, Kyushu, Japan. A gray dawn clung to the volcanic hills as a bitter wind swept across the runway, rattling the aluminum skin of 24 Yokosuka P-1Y-1 Francis bombers lined wing to wing. The scent of pine oil and alcohol burned in the air, the crude substitute for aviation fuel. Mechanics in stained flight suits worked with numb hands, siphoning liquid from rusting barrels, their breath clouds merging with exhaust fumes. Somewhere across the base, temple bells tolled the morning prayer for pilots who would never return. Inside the operations hut, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka, an intelligence officer with sunken eyes and frostbitten fingers, adjusted the focus on a magnifying viewer. The photograph on his desk was small, grainy, almost useless, yet it demanded his full attention. It had come from the submarine I-47, Commander Zenji Orita's boat, returning from a reconnaissance mission near Ulithi Atoll in the western Pacific. Tanaka's pen trembled as he wrote the report. 0630 hours. Large concrete vessel observed, approximately 80 meters, no armament visible, heavy refrigeration equipment on deck, multiple small craft conducting transfers. Classification: unknown logistic vessel. He leaned back in his chair, frowning. A ship made of concrete? With no guns? In 1945, Japan could barely keep its steel afloat, yet the Americans were wasting it on refrigeration? The door slid open, letting in a blast of cold air. Commander Saito, Tanaka's superior, stepped in, his uniform collar dusted with frost. "What is it now, Tanaka? Another fuel depot?" Tanaka handed him the photo. "Sir, it's not a combat ship. No armament, no radar, but..." Saito squinted, tilting the image toward the window. "Those are exhaust stacks?" "Refrigeration ducts, sir." "Huh," Saito laughed bitterly. "Impossible. Americans waste nothing in war." But deep down, Tanaka knew the Americans were already fighting a different kind of war. Outside, the pilots of Operation Tan No. 2 prepared for their one-way flight. Many were barely 20 years old. They tightened their hachimaki headbands, adjusted their flight goggles, and posed for photographs with soft smiles that concealed mortal acceptance. In a few hours, they would dive their aircraft into the American fleet at Ulithi, hoping to cripple carriers that Japan could no longer match. Tanaka's hands shook as he logged the entry. The tremor wasn't from the cold. It was something deeper. The sense that he had glimpsed a truth so absurd it had to be denied. Across the room, a junior intelligence clerk whispered, "They say the Americans eat like kings at Ulithi. Fresh bread, coffee, fruit. They even have theaters." Tanaka snapped. "Rumors. Silence." But the whisper persisted. "They say they have ships just for ice cream." The commander's jaw tightened. "Enough." He shut the folder, stamping its secret. That night, Tanaka lay awake in his bunk, listening to the engines roar as the kamikaze bombers departed into the darkness. He tried to imagine that strange vessel again, the one built not to kill, but to preserve something cold and sweet in a sea of death. He didn't know it yet, but that blurred photograph had captured a revolution in warfare, that Japan's empire, starving and shivering in its final months, could never comprehend.
The War of Ice and Fire. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands, December 1944. Through the narrow slit of the I-47's periscope, Commander Zenji Orita adjusted the focus wheel. The ocean's surface shimmered like a steel mirror beneath the tropical sun. The massive lagoon stretched endlessly, filled with hundreds of silhouettes. Carriers, battleships, tankers, repair barges, destroyers, an entire floating city humming with energy. "Mark bearing 270, range 2,000 meters, whispered the periscope officer. Arita's breath caught as he spotted something that made no tactical sense. A gray hulk, blocky and crude, its surface dull and seamless. Concrete. It sat quietly amid the steel giants, belching white vapor from its deck. No guns, no radar antenna, only pipes and cranes. Small boats moved back and forth, carrying sealed containers. What are they transferring? Not munitions, sir. Possibly Food? He hesitated before recording the log. Large concrete vessel observed, approximately 80 meters, no armament, heavy refrigeration equipment on deck, multiple small craft conducting transfers. He lowered the periscope, puzzled. A ship for cold storage in the middle of war. The I-47 descended into the deep, readying its chitin-manned torpedoes. In his cabin later that night, Orita wrote in his diary, "Perhaps they fight a war we do not understand." What Orita had seen was the U.S. Navy's Barge Refrigerated Large, the BRL. Converted from an Army concrete cargo barge, it was a floating factory of comfort. Installed with massive compressors and cooling coils, it produced 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, 500 gallons per shift, 5 tons a day. While Japan sailors licked pine sap for sugar, this vessel made dessert by the ton. Half a world away in Tokyo, scientists supervised a desperate pine root oil program. Children dug up tree roots in schoolyards, their fingers raw and bleeding, to extract oil that might power a single aircraft engine. 34,000 distillation units were built. 400,000 civilians were mobilized. The total output? 3,000 barrels of usable fuel, less than what the U.S. Navy consumed in one day. By January 1945, Japan's mightiest warship, the Yamato, could no longer sail for training missions. Every drop of fuel was sacred. Pilots at Kanoya reported night blindness from malnutrition. Their meals, rice balls and dried sardines. Their final letters home promised glorious death and eternal loyalty to the emperor. And while they starved, the Americans refined the science of morale. At Ulithi, sailors watched films projected onto makeshift screens, played baseball on Mogmog Island, and wrote letters in floating post offices that processed 20 tons of mail a day. The USS Abatan distilled seawater and baked pies. The bakery ship USS Whippoorwill produced thousands of loaves daily. And moored quietly at the center of this industrial paradise was the ice cream barge, an unarmed fortress of sweetness. Every carrier, battleship, and cruiser had its own ice cream machine. Destroyer crews, jealous and deprived, would row over with empty metal tins, returning with gallons of vanilla, chocolate, or strawberry. Officers and deckhands alike ate together. The ice cream barge became a symbol of democracy afloat, proof that even amid fire and fury, America's war machine could afford kindness. When I-47's report reached Kanoya, Tanaka's superiors dismissed it as absurd. But deep down, even they sensed the truth. Japan was collapsing into starvation. America was manufacturing joy. As Operation Ton No. 2 prepared to launch its kamikaze strike, the irony deepened. Those same bombers would hurl themselves at Ulithi. Against a fleet so well supplied, it could replace damaged ships faster than Japan could train new pilots. That night, Tanaka stood on the airstrip, watching the last bomber lift off. He thought of the photograph, of that absurd vessel built to make frozen cream in the middle of the Pacific, and whispered into the cold, "If they can afford to build ships for ice, how can we ever win?"
Luxury amid apocalypse. Ulithi Lagoon, March 1945. The sun blazed overhead, scattering gold across the sea as hundreds of ships swung gently at anchor. To an observer from the periscope of I-47, the lagoon appeared alive, a floating metropolis of steel and motion. Aircraft engines roared from carriers. Cranes creaked as they lifted supplies. Voices drifted across the water, mingled with the scent of diesel, salt, and something faintly sweet. That sweetness came from the barge refrigerated large, the ice cream barge. Inside the concrete hull, compressors hummed and pistons clattered. Navy technicians in white aprons checked pressure gauges and loaded powdered milk, sugar, and flavor mix into massive churns. Frost formed on the bulkheads, shining under the fluorescent lights. The men laughed as they worked, scooping the first batches into tin containers stamped U.S. Navy Morale Supply. Outside, a young sailor named George Larson guided a launch toward the barge, holding an empty canister between his boots.
"They'll trade us 2 gallons if we help with unloading," he said, shouting over the engine. His ship, the USS Brain, lacked its own ice cream machine. For destroyer crews, a taste of the frozen dessert was an event, a brief luxury in the monotony of salt water and gunpowder. They tied up alongside the barge. "Chocolate or vanilla?" asked the supply clerk. "Anything cold," Larson replied. The men grinned. The war felt far away. 3,000 miles to the northwest, Kanoa Air Base still burned from a recent raid. Fuel stores were empty. Wrecks of bombers smoldered on the field. Lieutenant Commander Tanaka received Arita's latest dispatch, clearer photographs this time. He studied them under a dim bulb, disbelief turning to dread. The Americans had built not one, but multiple refrigeration vessels. Reports filtered in from interrogations of captured Japanese sailors. Survivors from the Zuzwaku, rescued after Leyte Ulf, spoke of being served something they had never seen before, a sweet, frozen cream. They called it ice cream. They gave it to us after pulling us from the water. It was colder than death, and yet it tasted of mercy. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, founder of the Kamikaze Corps, suppressed these reports. "Such talk destroys morale," he warned. "Americans are weak. Their comfort is decay." But privately, even Onishi's staff whispered, if an enemy could serve ice cream in war, what else could he do? The Japanese command refused to believe that America's material strength could be this indulgent. Intelligence officers assumed the supply manifests were coded. Ice cream mix must mean explosives. Chocolate syrup must refer to fuel oil. No rational force could prioritize dessert while fighting for the Pacific. Yet it was true. Admiral Nimitz himself had approved the ice cream barge in 1944, believing morale was as vital as ammunition. In a memo now declassified, he wrote, "A sailor who knows his country can provide ice cream in combat fights with confidence no enemy can match." That philosophy extended to every ship. The USS Randolph alone consumed 3,000 gallons of ice cream during repairs after a kamikaze strike, enough to feed an entire Japanese regiment for a week. Meanwhile, at Kanoa Air Base, pilots wrote their death poems. The air smelled of pine oil and frost. Mechanic Yutaka Sato squeezed a few drops of alcohol from a machine pump, enough to fuel another takeoff. His comrade, barely 18, handed him a rice ball wrapped in paper. "For after the mission," he said softly. They both knew there would be no after. At 20:07 hours on March 11th, one of de France's bombers found its target, the USS Randolph. The explosion ripped through her stern, killing 25 and wounding over 100. But within hours, repair crews were at work under floodlights. Replacement steel arrived the next day, along with fresh ice cream from the barge. 3 weeks later, the Randolph rejoined the fleet. The kamikaze unit at Kanoa did not. For every Japanese aircraft destroyed, America produced 10 more. For every pilot lost, America sent another sailor home with a full stomach and a metal tub of vanilla ice cream. It wasn't arrogance. It was industrial inevitability. Comfort weaponized as confidence. And for Tanaka, staring at those photos from I-47, the realization was unbearable. They fight a war of abundance. We fight a war of ghosts.
The taste of defeat. April 6, 1945. Off Okinawa, Pacific Ocean. The horizon was a haze of smoke and thunder. American radar screens glowed red as wave after wave of kamikaze aircraft descended out of the cloud banks. 450 in total. The largest suicide assault in human history had begun. From the decks of the USS Laffey, sailors manned their 20mm guns as screaming Zeros fell from the sky like burning comets. The sea turned to fire. The concussion of exploding planes shattered windows and flung men to the deck. Yet amid the chaos, the routine continued. Damage control parties sealed bulkheads, medics tended the wounded, and below deck, cooks still worked the galley. Chief Steward Walter Evans later wrote in his diary, "They kept firing above me while I stirred the ice cream mix. Didn't make sense to stop. Men wanted something cold after the smoke cleared." The Laffey survived that day, scarred and burning, but alive.
And as the surviving crew sat on deck with scorched uniforms and trembling hands, they passed around dented metal cups filled with melting ice cream. No speeches, no victory songs, just quiet spoonfuls of cold sweetness. Normalcy, reclaimed from hell. For the Japanese pilots who had died attacking them, their final meals had been rice and water. For the Americans, their post-battle ritual was dessert. Back in Kanoya, word of the failed operations spread like frostbite. The airfield's flight line was empty now, the hangars echoing with silence. Tanaka walked past rows of abandoned planes, fuselages stripped for parts, canopies shattered. On a workbench lay a single death poem, written in brushstrokes that quivered with youth. Like cherry blossoms, we fall, pure and radiant. Tanaka folded it gently, knowing the young man's name had already been lost in the sea. He had once believed in Bushido, the sacred power of sacrifice. Now he believed in arithmetic. For every Japanese bomber that fell, America made 10. For every gallon of pine oil squeezed from roots, America produced thousands of barrels of aviation gasoline and a few more gallons of ice cream. Elsewhere in the Pacific, the industrial rhythm continued. At Ulithi, the ice cream barge never stopped churning. 10 gallons every 7 minutes. Day and night, its compressors sang the hymn of American abundance. Destroyer crews lined up with buckets and thermos jugs, exchanging gossip and laughter. To them, it wasn't luxury, it was routine. It was precisely that normalcy that Japan could not comprehend. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, of submarine I-58, the man who would later sink the USS Indianapolis, recorded in his war diary after observing Ulithi through his periscope, "The Americans maintain peacetime in war. While we ration oil by the liter, they create floating cities of pleasure. We fight with devotion. They fight with confidence. They are stronger." Hashimoto's words would never reach Tokyo in time. The illusion of victory still hung over Japan's decaying command. Officers still spoke of spiritual purity while their soldiers starved. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz reviewed the Okinawa reports aboard his flagship. His staff briefed him. 6 ships sunk, 22 damaged, casualties heavy, yet morale remained high. One note stood out in the report. Ice cream consumption increased 40% after engagement. Nimitz smiled faintly. He understood the message. Morale wasn't about slogans or divine wind. It was about small things: hot coffee, clean socks, and above all, the promise of comfort. That was how democracies fought wars, not through devotion to death, but through investment in life. In Tokyo, fuel reserves had dropped below 1.5 million barrels. Civilians ate 1,600 calories a day at best. Children fainted during air raid drills. Yet as B-29s darkened the sky, propaganda films insisted that American soldiers are soft. They need sugar to fight. By June 45, those sugar-fed soldiers stood at Okinawa. The empire was burning. And far below them, deep in the ocean trenches, the submarines of the I series crept through darkness, blind, starving, hopeless. Commander Orita's last patrol log closed with one sentence written in weary resignation. "We were men fighting ghosts made of steel and comfort."
When comfort became strategy. Tokyo, July 1945. The capital was a wasteland of ashes and silence. Rows of houses had been reduced to gray powder, and the summer heat carried the stench of burnt wood, oil, and flesh. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Tanaka trudged past the ruins of Ueno Station with a stack of reports clutched to his chest. Each page was another confirmation that the war was mathematically over, though no one dared say it aloud. At Naval Headquarters, he entered the intelligence room, where fans spun lazily in the humid air. His superior, Commander Saito, sat with his sleeves rolled up, sweat staining his collar. "Another submarine report?" he asked without looking up. Tanaka laid the folder on the desk. I-58 confirms the same pattern as I-47. More unarmed concrete ships with refrigeration equipment, continuous production of food supplies. They are calling them floating factories. Saito frowned. Factories for what? Tanaka hesitated. For ice cream, sir. The room went silent. A junior officer laughed nervously, but Saito's face did not change. You mean to tell me that while we drain engine fluid for alcohol fuel, the Americans build ships for frozen milk? Yes, sir, Tanaka said quietly. They call it morale supply. Every fleet anchorage has them. The ice cream is distributed by destroyers to smaller ships daily. Saito opened a cigarette case and stared at it a moment before putting it away. If this report is true, then we never had a chance. That same month in the Central Pacific, the ice cream barges ran 24 hours a day. On the decks of carriers like the USS Randolph and USS Bunker Hill, sailors queued in orderly lines, metal cups in hand. Above them, fighters roared off the flight deck toward Japan. Below decks, compressors hissed as machines froze 10 gallons every 7 minutes. The air smelt faintly of vanilla and machine oil. To the Japanese, it was unthinkable decadence. To the Americans, it was simply logistics. Every sailor above destroyer class had access to ice cream. Every major base had a plant. By mid-1945, over 80 million gallons had been produced for the U.S. military, enough to give every soldier and sailor a pint per week. Dehydrated ice cream mix was shipped by the hundreds of tons. Chocolate syrup and strawberry topping, once dismissed by Japanese intelligence as coded references to fuel, were exactly what they seemed. For men who had been fighting for months without seeing land, a scoop of ice cream was more than dessert. It was proof that their country cared, that home wasn't just a word on a postcard. Meanwhile, Japan's last elite air group, the 343rd Kokutai, under Captain Minoru Genda, could barely stay airborne. Pilots suffered muscle tremors from malnutrition, their reflexes dulled, their night vision failing from vitamin deficiency. Genda wrote in his final operational report, "My men shake in their cockpits from hunger. They cannot pull G-forces in combat. Their eyes fail them. Yet, they still fly." It was the cruelest contrast imaginable. One side nourished, the other starving. One fighting to live, the other fighting to die. American bombers flying 30,000 feet over Japan occasionally mixed milk powder, sugar, and cocoa in spare ammunition cans, using sub-zero temperatures and turbulence to freeze the mixture mid-flight. They were literally making ice cream over Tokyo, as Japanese civilians crouched in basements, praying beneath the roar of B-29s. By August, the Pine Route Fuel Program, Japan's last attempt at survival, had collapsed. 34,000 distillation units, hundreds of thousands of workers, millions of hours. The result? 3,000 barrels of aviation fuel, enough for perhaps a week of limited flight operations. The Americans produced that much ice cream in 2 days. On August 6th, a new kind of weapon erased Hiroshima. On the 9th, Nagasaki followed. Between those two flashes of light, Tanaka sat in his darkened office, staring at the last reconnaissance photograph from I-58, the same concrete vessel, steam still rising from its deck. He whispered the thought no Japanese officer dared to speak. "We have been defeated not by weapons, but by what they could afford to build." Across the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz read the final reports from Okinawa. His aides discussed fuel logistics, troop rotations, and the coming invasion of Japan. Nimitz listened quietly, then made a small note in his margin. Morale, as critical as munitions, ice cream production to continue indefinitely. The war of spirit was over. The war of systems had won.
The Surrender of Illusions. Tokyo Bay, September 2nd, 1945. A heavy mist hung over the deck of the USS Missouri. The sea was calm, the sky pale and thin, as if the world itself held its breath. Cameras clicked, boots struck steel in unison, and between the ranks of American sailors and Marines, a column of Japanese officers walked slowly toward the small table at the center of history. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemutsu limped forward on his cane. Behind him stood General Yoshijiro Umezu, his face expressionless. They had come from a nation starved into silence, where rice rations had fallen below 300 grams per day,
where pilots once promised immortality now wandered airfields of twisted wreckage. As pens scratched paper, the war that had devoured the Pacific ended in less than 5 minutes. On another ship nearby, a supply vessel moored within sight of the ceremony, sailors were setting out lunch. Sandwiches, coffee, canned fruit, and, as always, ice cream. To them, it was just another day. They watched the surrender through binoculars, eating from metal cups, the sweetness melting against the salt air. For the men who had fought through Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the frozen dessert had become a ritual, a symbol of survival and home. It was the same meal they had eaten after kamikaze strikes, after rescue missions, after the burial at sea of shipmates. The same taste they had carried from Ulithi to Okinawa to the waters off Japan. The war had been fought on 2 fronts, one of blood and one of comfort. And only now did the Japanese understand which had truly mattered. A few weeks later, American troops disembarked across a ruined Japan. Men in khaki and blue, armed not just with rifles, but with crates of food. They distributed chocolate, canned goods, and ice cream mix to civilians who had never known such abundance. Children lined up in rags, their faces hollow, but their eyes wide with disbelief. For the first time in their lives, they tasted sweetness. At Kanoya Air Base, now occupied by American engineers, a small group of local children approached the soldiers, curious but cautious. One Marine knelt and handed them tin cups filled with soft, melting vanilla ice cream from a field refrigerator. The smallest boy hesitated, then took a spoonful, his expression shifting from confusion to pure joy. The soldiers laughed softly. Somewhere in the background, the engines of a transport plane droned, carrying home the first wave of veterans. In the burned-out remains of Tokyo, former kamikaze trainer Lieutenant Tadamasa Itatsu watched a similar scene unfold. A group of U.S. Navy cooks were serving ice cream to a line of Japanese children outside the gates of a requisitioned warehouse. He turned to a fellow officer and said quietly, "We taught our boys to die hungry. They taught theirs to live full." That moment marked a different kind of surrender, not of armies, but of ideas. Comfort, once condemned by Japanese ideology as weakness, revealed itself as civilization's ultimate weapon. The Americans had fought not just to destroy, but to preserve, to make the unbearable bearable. The Japanese archives record no official recognition of the ice cream barges, but among those who had seen them, men like Tanaka, Orita, and Hashimoto, the memory endured like a riddle they could never solve. Years later, when Tanaka testified during the post-war analysis of Japan's intelligence failures, he was asked what moment made him realize victory was impossible. He answered without hesitation, "The day I saw a photograph of the ship that made ice." Across the Pacific, the men who had served aboard the Ulithi ice cream barge were being discharged. They returned to their farms and factories, to wives who had waited and children they barely knew. When asked about the barge, most shrugged. "It wasn't anything special," said one. "We just made sure everyone got a scoop after a fight. You do what you can for morale." They never understood that what seemed ordinary to them was extraordinary to everyone else. The Empire of Japan had built warriors to endure suffering. America had built an army that never needed to. Decades later, historians would call it the War of Abundance, a conflict won not only by bullets and bombs, but with an unshakable belief that comfort was not luxury, but strength. And so, on that misty morning in Tokyo Bay, as the ink dried and the flags shifted in the sea breeze, the true symbol of victory was not the battleship or the bomb, but a quiet barge that once floated among 722 ships, churning 10 gallons of ice cream every 7 minutes, proving that a civilization confident enough to bring dessert to war had already won before the fighting ever began. The end.